Under the glow of the banquet hall lights, my own son, David Vance, lifted his champagne glass and laughed loud enough for every cousin, colleague, and stranger to hear. Can you believe my old man still drives that rusted heap? I wouldn't. Put my groceries in that thing, let alone my kids. The laughter that followed stabbed deeper than any knife. They weren't laughing at an old car. They were laughing at me at 76 years old, stripped bare in front of my bloodline. My name is Edmund Vance. I built a career in Detroit as a safety engineer, the kind of man who spent 40 years making sure families walked away from crashes that would have killed them a generation earlier. I never cared for trophies or applause. The one piece of my life I held on to was that old car parked outside my modest house, the car my son had just turned into a punchline. To the crowd, it was a wreck. To me, it was a living reminder of nights in the garage with Margaret, my late wife, when we were young and hopeful. It was a reminder of the day that car's reinforced frame saved her life. None of them knew that. Truth. They only saw a relic, and my son wanted them to laugh at it. David was 45, tall, polished, with a suit that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He worked in finance, walked like he owned the world, and treated me like a stain on his pristine shirt. He pulled up to that party in a luxury SUV, gleaming, spotless, an emblem of everything he thought I wasn't. I stayed quiet, as I often did, though the silence burned my throat. They thought my quietness meant weakness. They never understood. It was patience. I sat through the celebration, watching as David soaked in admiration. People crowded around his SUV parked outside, admiring its design, its power, its perfect lines. None of them knew that the company that built that SUV had been half-born in a garage where I worked long nights. None of them knew I still held 40% of its life in my hands. I had kept it hidden from David, from Rebecca, from the world. They believed I was a man with nothing but an old house, a pension, and a rusting car. That was the way I wanted it. Until that night, when David's laughter pulled a veil off every wound I had tried to bury. It wasn't the insult that hurt most. It was the ease with which it came. The son I had raised to know dignity and gratitude was standing tall by humiliating me. I watched Linda, his wife, smiling faintly, her arms folded, her eyes sharp. She was always sharper than she let on, always. Calculating, she didn't laugh with the crowd, but she didn't stop them either. She stood beside him, comfortable in his arrogance, feeding it quietly. I saw the seed of something in her that night, a hunger for control that went beyond money. I thought of Rebecca, my daughter. She wasn't at the party that evening. 50 years old, once tender-hearted, now distant, married into a life where practicality outweighed sentiment. I had hoped she would stand closer to me than her brother, but time had eroded our bond. She rarely called. When she did, it was short, clipped, as if talking to me was another task on her list. I didn't yet know what side she would choose when the storm broke, but I suspected she would bend toward advantage, not affection. The image of Margaret came to me in flashes as I sat in that hall, her soft hand on mine as we signed our first mortgage papers, her laughter echoing through the kitchen while I worked late on drafts of safety schematics. The memory of the night, the car, that same battered vehicle, had folded around her in a crash but spared her life because of the reinforcements. I'd welded into it. David had been a boy then, too young to remember. For me, that car was not metal and bolts. It was the embodiment of love, survival, and the reason I could look my children in the eyes. To have it mocked felt like watching Margaret herself be mocked. The party ended with David basking in attention, leading a tour of his SUV for the last stragglers, showing off its gadgets as though he had designed them himself. He passed me once, eyes sliding over me as though I were furniture, not father. My chest tightened. The humiliation clung like smoke. I shook hands, nodded politely, left without fanfare. No one noticed. They rarely did at home. I sat in the garage beside the old car, the one they had laughed at. The paint was faded, the edges rusted, but I ran my hand along the hood like a man greeting an old friend. It was not just a machine. It was proof of a life lived with purpose. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed up late, balancing calculations with grease-stained fingers, driven by an idea that safety mattered more than profit. My children didn't know those nights. They only knew the result. A father who lived humbly, who never paraded wealth, who let them believe he had little. I looked at the SUV brochure David had left behind, the glossy photographs of sleek steel, and promises of prestige. Inside, I saw echoes of my own designs, the same principles I had fought for, dressed now in glamour. I knew the company better than David ever would. I knew the people who had bled their hands on the assembly lines, the boardroom battles, the lawsuits fought to preserve safety standards. 40% of that company's veins still ran through my name. But I had chosen silence, chosen to let my family think me ordinary. That night, silence no longer felt noble. It felt like surrender. I thought of the laughter echoing off those banquet hall walls. I thought of Linda's cold smile. I thought of how David's SUV, polished and adored, was being celebrated while my car, scarred but faithful, was scorned. I felt the tremor of anger rise, not for myself alone, but for Margaret, for every worker who had given their lives to make sure families like mine survived accidents. I told myself then, as the clock struck midnight and the garage lights dimmed, that patience had reached its limit. My son believed he was mocking a piece of scrap metal. In truth, he had mocked his mother's survival, my life's work, and the soul of a company he knew nothing about. He thought I was powerless. He thought wrong. I slept little that night, my mind circling back to the humiliation, the way strangers had laughed because my own son had invited them to. I had endured a lifetime of storms with dignity, but this storm felt different. It was not just about respect. It was about erasure. David's SUV was built on my legacy, and yet he stood proud, as though he were the heir to something he had never bled for. He had no idea how much of his world rested on the decisions I had made decades earlier. He had no idea how fragile his pride really was. The first fracture had opened that night, and though no one else saw it, I knew the cracks would spread. Families don't break all at once. They splinter, piece by piece, until one day there's nothing left to hold them together. As I sat in the garage, hand resting on the old steering wheel, I realized the fracture had already begun. That car was more than a relic. It was the fuse. And David, with his champagne glass and his laughter, had just lit the match. The morning after that humiliating banquet, I found an envelope slid under my front door. Inside was a stack of papers, dressed up in polite language, promising convenience and protection. At the top sat the neat handwriting of Linda, my daughter-in-law, a woman whose calm face hid sharp intentions. The documents asked me to grant her and David the right to manage my accounts, to lighten the burden of bills, insurance, and property taxes. To anyone else, it looked like concern, To me, it was a leash. I called David, asked why his wife was sending me papers meant for my signature without so much as a conversation. He brushed it off, saying they were just trying to help, that handling finances at my age could get overwhelming. His tone was the same tone he used when speaking to strangers. He wanted something from polite, but stripped of respect. I could hear Linda in the background, speaking to him in clipped phrases, guiding his words. I knew then this was not his idea. He had always been careless with money. It was her mind steering this move. Rebecca came to the house that weekend. She hadn't visited in months, and her sudden arrival carried an edge I couldn't ignore. She was my daughter, once the most empathetic of the family, the one who had cried hardest when Margaret passed. She stepped into the kitchen, kissed my cheek with a distracted air, and pulled the same set of papers from her bag. Her words were careful, rehearsed, as if she had practiced them in the mirror. She told me signing would make things simpler, that managing assets alone was too much for a man in his 70s. I asked her why she believed I couldn't handle my own affairs. She avoided my eyes, staring instead at the chipped counter where Margaret's hands once prepared countless meals. She muttered something about hearing rumors that I'd been sending large sums of money to places that didn't make sense. She said David was worried that Linda had done research. In that moment, I realized the quiet transfers I had been making to support a fund for retired auto workers had been twisted into evidence of recklessness. To them, my loyalty looked like madness. I told Rebecca the money had gone to men and women who had spent decades breaking their bodies on factory lines. Men who had lost pensions when companies folded. Men who couldn't afford medical bills. Her lips tightened. She said the family didn't know any of those people, and my responsibility was here with them. Her voice was firm, but beneath it I heard hesitation. She wanted to believe she was protecting me, but she also wanted to stay in step with her brother and his wife. That evening, I went to the small church where Pastor Williams served. He had been in the neighborhood as long as I had, his sermons steady, his counsel honest. I asked him if he thought generosity was a weakness when family disapproved. He told me generosity was never weakness, but he also reminded me that secrets fester when light never reaches them. He suggested I speak plainly to my children about why I gave money away, to show them it was not the erratic spending of an old man, but a choice rooted in dignity. I nodded, though I knew already they wouldn't listen. To them, my reasons didn't matter. What mattered was control. Days later, Linda came herself. She sat in my living room with her legs crossed, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly over her lap. She spoke like a lawyer, steady, clear, unflinching. She said managing my finances would allow me to enjoy my years without stress, that she and David had the resources to keep everything in order. She mentioned the word protection so often it began to sound like a threat. Protection from what? From whom? The way she said it, I understood she wasn't offering to protect me. She was offering to protect their interests. She slid the pen across the table with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. I stared at it, then at her, and refused. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply gathered her papers and stood, telling me they would give me time to think. Her calmness unsettled me more than anger would have. Anger leaves cracks. Her composure was a wall. The next week, Rebecca returned. She wasn't alone this time. She brought photographs, bank statements, transfers, highlighted lines of money leaving my accounts. She spoke with urgency, telling me people were beginning to question my stability. She said if I didn't let David and Linda step in, outsiders might decide for me. It was a cruel twist of words, suggesting that the state might intervene as if I were incapable of making decisions. I asked her if she remembered the nights I came home late, carrying blueprints stained with grease, too tired to sit but proud that the work I was doing would save lives. I asked her if she remembered the car accident that almost killed her mother, and how the frame I had reinforced kept her alive. Her face softened for a moment, the memory cutting through the distance between us. Then her expression hardened. Again, she said, "That was then, this is now. We have to be practical, practical." That was the word that drew the line. To them, practicality meant stripping me of the right to choose what to do with the life I had built. To me, practicality had always meant working until your hands bled so your family had a roof, food, and safety. Their practicality was not mine. Walked her to the door that day, refusing to sign, watching her shoulders stiffen as she stepped off my porch. I saw her phone light up in her hand, and I knew exactly who she was calling. She would tell David that I was being stubborn, that I was making trouble, that I was slipping further into what they called denial. I stood in the doorway long after. She drove away, the papers left behind on my table like a silent accusation. The quiet in the house grew heavier with each passing day. My family had stopped asking. They were demanding, maneuvering, conspiring. They no longer looked at me as father, as elder, as man. They looked at me as an obstacle, a stubborn relic standing in the way of their vision of the future. But the truth burned inside me. I wasn't the one losing grip. They were. They had forgotten the cost of everything they took for granted. They wanted the name, the assets, the appearance of control, but they had no idea what it meant to build something from nothing, to bleed for it, to bury parts of yourself inside it. The old car sat in my garage, silent, rust gathering along its edges. They thought it was proof of my decline. They didn't understand it was proof of my endurance. And as I sat alone that night, the papers still untouched, I realized this battle was only beginning. They wanted signatures. They wanted power. What they were about to discover was that signatures can deceive, power can vanish, but the truth has teeth. The first time I saw the phone pointed at me, I thought nothing of it. My grandson Thomas was lounging on the couch in my living room, thumbs moving faster than my eyes could follow, muttering to himself in that careless tone young men have when the world feels like it belongs to them. He asked me if I even knew how to turn on a smartphone. I shrugged, told him I didn't care for gadgets. He laughed, a hollow, rehearsed sound, and I heard the faint click of recording. It wasn't the first time he laughed at me, but it was the first time he turned that laughter into something consumable, something meant for strangers. He asked me to say something old-fashioned, and when I told him stories about welding frames in the factory, he cut me off, smirking, asking if cars back then were held together with duct tape. His phone caught it all, my voice low, his voice mocking. The silence between us wide enough to split the house in two. Later that night, when he thought I had gone to bed, I heard him laughing again in the kitchen. His voice was joined by others, not in the room but echoing from his phone. He had uploaded the recording. Within hours, people I had never met were leaving comments, repeating his jokes, reducing decades of work into a few seconds of ridicule. By morning, the clip had traveled further than I could have imagined. Neighbors mentioned it in passing, chuckling, not realizing the knife they twisted with their smiles. I asked Thomas why he did it. He shrugged, said it was just for fun, that everyone did it, that it didn't matter, but it did matter. It mattered when I saw men at the diner glance at me with smirks. It mattered when a cashier called me that guy from the video. It mattered because the ridicule no longer stayed within family walls. My own blood had carried it to the world and invited strangers to laugh at me. What Thomas didn't realize was that others were watching too, people beyond our neighborhood. The company I had once helped build thrived on reputation, on the illusion of innovation and strength. Rivals saw the clip and seized it, whispering about instability, about an old founder gone soft, a family divided. They spoke in boardrooms and emails, saying perhaps the time had come to move past the men who had built the company's foundations. They pointed to that video as proof that the past had no weight, no dignity left. I found out from Henry Ann, old contact still working with the firm, that the footage had been circulated as evidence that I was slipping, that my own grandson had given them ammunition to erase me. It wasn't just mockery anymore. It was a weapon, sharpened by carelessness and greed. When I confronted David about it, he brushed it aside. He said Thomas was just a kid, that kids make mistakes that no one would remember in a week. He didn't see, or refused to see, how quickly perception hardens into narrative. He didn't understand that in an industry built on image, humiliation sticks longer than truth. Linda, standing behind him, didn't even try to apologize. Her silence was consent. Rebecca called that evening, her voice hesitant. She said she had seen the clip too. For a moment, I thought she might defend me, might finally step forward where others had stepped back. But her words cut deep. She told me it was embarrassing, that perhaps it was time to step away from things that could make me a target. Her suggestion was cloaked in concern, but the meaning was clear. She was telling me to stop being visible, to retreat, to fade. I sat in the garage that night, the old car looming in the shadows, its body worn, its frame strong. I remembered the accident, the night Margaret nearly died, the metal bending but not breaking because I had poured my life into its design. I had saved her. That car had held her alive in its arms when the world tried to take her, yet my own blood reduced it to a joke, and by extension reduced me. The humiliation spread like rust. At the grocery store, a stranger asked me if I'd upgraded to something less prehistoric. At the church, men I had prayed beside for decades looked at me with pity rather than respect. Even Pastor Williams, though kind, advised me not to dwell on the ridicule. But dwelling wasn't the problem. The problem was the laughter echoing beyond my walls, amplified by the hands of my grandson, condoned by my son, tolerated by my daughter, orchestrated silently by my daughter-in-law. One evening, as I walked back from the diner, I passed a group of teenagers crowded around a phone. My face flickered on the screen, paired with Thomas's mocking voice. They laughed without restraint, their laughter chasing me down the street. It struck me then that humiliation doesn't just sting in private, it reshapes how the world treats you. It changes the air around you. I went home and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I had once shared meals, where David and Rebecca had done homework, where Thomas had played with toy cars as a child. I thought about how easily they had traded memory for spectacle, how little weight they placed on sacrifice, how casually they had invited strangers into our family to laugh at me. But beneath the weight of shame, a spark of something else began to grow. They thought the laughter would weaken me, that embarrassment would make me retreat. They didn't understand that every jeer, every careless joke, every smirk was building something inside me, not rage, not despair, resolve. I knew the cracks in the family were widening. I knew David would dismiss the damage. Linda would plot. Rebecca would drift further from me. Thomas would chase attention. They were pushing me toward a corner, expecting me to curl into it quietly. What they had forgotten was that corners force a man to stand, to brace, to look forward. As I lay in bed that night, the house silent around me, I felt the weight of humiliation pressing in. But I also felt clarity. The video had done more than mock me. It had shown me exactly where I stood in my family, in my community, in the company I had once helped raise. It had shown me what they truly thought of me, and knowing that truth, I understood what needed to come next. Henry Clark asked me to meet him at a diner off Gratiot, the kind of place where the napkins are thin and the coffee is honest. He had always favored simple rooms for serious talk. Henry was my old partner from the early days, a fellow founder whose hands had known the weight of real tools before they ever touched a boardroom folder. He was 75 now, solid as a fence post, still wearing those steel-toed boots like a promise. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He looked at me, then at the window, then back at me with a map of worry across his brow, and told me I needed to hear something before it became a headline I couldn't outrun. He said the clip Thomas posted had moved in circles that didn't belong to teenagers. Executives were trading it like a rumor they wanted to believe, attaching it to memos with careful language about optics and forward direction. He had seen emails from decision-makers who never lifted a wrench but wrote as if they had earned the right to judge every hand that ever did. In those notes, my name appeared, alongside phrases like legacy risk and narrative shift. He told me a presentation had been scheduled with a foreign conglomerate, a clean, smiling machine that specialized in swallowing smaller firms whole. The pitch deck claimed our brand would be re-energized by global capital. He paused there, then said David was helping introduce the deal. The words landed like a cold stone. David had always chased the shine of new money, but it stung to hear he was standing in rooms where strangers weighed pieces of my life like merchandise. Henry described how David had framed it: an aging founder, a family ready to modernize, fresh leadership aligned with current values. The video of me fumbling with a phone played the role of proof, not of ability, but of image. They didn't need me to be incompetent. They needed me to look replaceable. Henry didn't soften the next part. He said there was talk of cleaning up the company history in the rebranding, streamlining the origin story, consolidating names, placing innovation at the feet of the team rather than a handful of stubborn men from Detroit who insisted on safety before style. My name was on the list of items marked optional. He said it the way a doctor says surgery. I understood. They weren't just preparing to sell a company. They were preparing to erase a man. He reached into a folder and slid across a copy of something I hadn't seen in years. The founder's consent clause. We had drafted it back when the company was nothing but sweat and second-hand equipment. A safeguard buried inside the bylaws, meant to protect the mission when money, people came calling. It required the personal approval of both founders, their designated successors under strict notarized terms for any transaction that transferred controlling interest or diminished core safety standards. There was no automatic handoff. 2 heirs. Names had to be written by our hands. The papers still carried the ghost of oil from the day we signed it. Henry tapped a line with a blunt finger and reminded me that consent from my side could only be granted by me, not by anyone who shared my last name. Then he told me what had shaken him enough to call me. David had already approached him with a set of documents titled as routine modernization, Hidden in the stack was a waiver. Signing it would have released Henry's side of consent and asserted that I was no longer in a position to reasonably exercise fiduciary judgment. The phrasing was neat, careful, lethal. There was a supporting letter attached, not from a doctor who knew me, but from one of those medical services that churn evaluations into paperwork the way factories used to churn scrap into parts. Henry said David had spoken about me as if I were already gone, a beloved patriarch who should be allowed to rest while younger minds guided the future. Henry didn't sign. He sent David away and told him no one would be erasing the engine that kept this place from breaking apart. But he also told me he could not block both doors alone. The protection only held if I stood up and used it. We drank the coffee like medicine. He said there would be another meeting, and soon, because money always hates delays. I left the diner. With the copy of the clause under my coat and the winter air hardening my resolve, I went straight to the bank where the old safe deposit box sat quiet behind a steel door. The clerk recognized me with the vague politeness reserved for regulars who pay on time and ask for nothing more. Inside the box, under an envelope that still carried Margaret's handwriting from decades ago, lay the original founder's papers, stamped and notarized, with a separate addendum we had fought for after an early near acquisition, a single certificate that acted as a stop valve. Lawyers had called it a special consent share. I had called it a brake pedal. It gave me the right to halt any sale or merger that threatened the company's safety charter or moved control beyond our set threshold without both founders saying yes. The certificate still gleamed, a small, stubborn square of authority. I made copies and locked the original back in place. On my way home, I stopped by the old neighborhood print shop to notarize a statement of intent, simple language affirming that I was of sound mind and fully aware of the protections I held. The manager had watched me age over the counter for 30 years. He slid the paperwork back with a nod that said more than words. At home, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. The house creaked around me, familiar and faithful, as if it too wanted me to keep what mattered standing. I compared Henry's copy to mine line by line, checking signatures, dates, and clauses. Everything matched. The law in those pages was plain enough for anyone willing to read it without ambition fogging their eyes. Consent lived in the hands of two men. I was one of them. I called Henry and told him I had the certificate ready. He said the board was moving faster than he liked. He had seen calendar invites go out for what they called a strategic realignment briefing. He warned me that David would try a different door now that the front one had been shut. He would push a story that my judgment was compromised, that my donations to retired workers proved a decline in prudence. In the world they lived in, care looked like weakness. The next day, a letter arrived by courier. It came from a law firm with a view of the river and a habit of speaking for people who purchased things they didn't understand. The letter invited me to a wellness assessment at a private clinic, the kind of euphemism that hides a hook. Participation, they said, would help the company plan. It would honor my legacy while ensuring continuity. They put my life's work and my mind on the same polite line, as if both could be tidied by a well-phrased report. I declined in writing and copied Henry on the reply. After I sent the letter, I drove to the plant. They call it a campus now. But the wind still carries the smell of metal in the places where the old line once rattled. I watched from the edge of the lot as workers filtered out at shift change. New faces, different languages, the same tired shoulders and proud backs. I didn't announce myself. I didn't ask for recognition. I stood where I had stood 1,000 times before and measured what was at stake. If the sale went through the way those glossy slides promised, corners would be cut in the name of efficiency, and the numbers that sat between corporate and catastrophe would loosen by degrees. I knew all the excuses. I had spent my life refusing them. I met Henry again in a quiet office near the factory museum. We spread our documents and went over the plan like two men preparing to hold a gate while a crowd pressed against it. He would notify the board formally that consent was not available and would not be granted under any version of the proposed transaction. I would file my certificate with the state records and the company's counsel, creating a trail that could not be brushed aside when the marketing team spun their next story. He told me he expected blowback. I told him I expected worse. By the end of the week, David called, voice rehearsed and warm, asking for a family meeting. He said it would be good for us to talk, that misunderstandings were blooming. He wanted to gather at my house. I agreed. I wanted him to sit where his mother had sat and tell me to my face what he had been telling strangers behind my back. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. David sat forward in his chair, elbows on knees, using the posture of a man ready to empathize. Linda placed a folder on the table and kept her hands folded, the way she did when she wanted to look harmless. Rebecca stayed near the window, arms crossed, watching the street as if someone might rescue her from choosing a side. Thomas hovered in the doorway, itching for his phone but wise enough, for once, to keep it in his pocket. David spoke about the future, about scale, about leverage and partnerships. He said the world had changed and the company needed to change. With it, he said my experience was respected and that the sale would honor it properly. He used the word honor twice. Then he suggested I sign a simple set of acknowledgements, statements that would streamline decisions and secure my comfort. I told them I had reviewed their proposals and that I would not be signing anything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scold. I reported the facts. A clause written by founders, a certificate held by me, a consent requirement that could not be bypassed by presentations, clinics, or polite letters. I said the law would be respected. Silence settled for a moment. Linda's face didn't move, but I watched the calculation tighten behind her eyes. Rebecca looked down at her shoes. Thomas shifted his weight and stared at the ceiling. David tried to smile again, then let it fall. He asked how I could stand in the way of progress. I told him I had never stood in the way of progress in my life. I had spent it making sure progress didn't leave bodies in its wake. He moved next to strategy. He said investors would be disappointed, that jobs could be at risk, that my stubbornness might be seen as selfishness. He gestured to the viral clip as if it were a weather report he couldn't control. I told him reputations can be repaired with work. Lives cannot be repaired once lost to someone else's rush. He said I was being dramatic. I said I was being exact. They left with their folder unopened. On the porch, I heard David tell Linda they would proceed another way. That was when I understood how far they were willing to go. The path of persuasion had run its course. The path of removal would begin. The company's counsel called 2 days later, requesting a meeting to clarify governance. I agreed and brought my papers. The counsel, a careful man with precise glasses, explained that management wanted to ensure alignment and asked whether I would consider appointing a proxy for consent matters. I asked him whether the bylaws required me to appoint anyone. He admitted they did not. I placed the certificate on the table so he could read it in silence. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that the door they wanted was, for now, locked. Yet pressure has a way of finding cracks. Rumors began to float through town about my health, my memory, my temper. Someone started a story that I had lashed out at a cashier, another that I had driven through a red light and refused to admit it. None of it happened. All of it spread. I kept a log of every conversation, every letter, every call. I made copies of copies and stored them in different places. I had learned long ago that memory is not enough when people decide to deny what they did. Paper is a witness that does not blink. Henry called late one evening and told me a second briefing had been added. The foreign buyer was flying in. The board was splitting into camps. Some wanted the money. Some wanted the mission. Everyone wanted it resolved fast. He told me to expect a vote to request my resignation from advisory. Roles, a show gesture with no legal weight but plenty of theatre. He asked if I was ready to stand in a room where applause would belong to the sale. I told him I had stood in rooms with worse noise. That night I sat beside the old car in the garage and laid my palm flat on the hood. The metal was cool, steady, honest. It had no interest in markets or optics. It cared where the bolts held, and steel did what it was supposed to do under force. I thought about Margaret and the breath she took after the crash, trembling and alive because something I had built did not fail under pressure. That was the standard I recognized. In the days that followed, I did not shout. I did not plead. I filed. I notarized. I documented. I brought the certificate to the state registry and paid the fee myself. I notified the board in writing that any attempt to transfer controlling interest without my signed consent would be contested immediately. I sent a copy to the firm courting the sale so their suits could read for themselves that the path they had chosen passed through me. When I sealed the last envelope, I felt the center of gravity swing back to where it always should have been. They had assumed an old man would be a speed bump. Instead, they found a steel gate with a lock forged years before they learned to write a business plan. I knew what would come next. People who fail to move you with charm will try to move you with force. If they couldn't slide me out of the company, they would try to slide me out of my life. I set the papers in a drawer and turned off the garage light. The house settled around me like an ally waiting in the dark. Outside, the winter wind scraped across the siding. Inside, the engine of the past hummed steady. They were coming for the company story first. The home would be next. I could feel the shift like a change in air pressure before a storm. I had braced for impact my whole life. I braced again. It began with a family gathering that was supposed to be ordinary. Another Sunday meal meant to show the world that we were still a unit. David insisted on hosting at my house, claiming it was important to use the old place before it lost its charm. I knew better. He wanted to measure the walls, to calculate what could be stripped and sold. The living room filled with the sound of overlapping conversations, the clink of glasses, and the kind of laughter that rings hollow when people are thinking of everything except joy. Thomas arrived with that same restless energy, moving from room to room with his phone out, scanning the house as though he were documenting an exhibit. He pointed the camera at the pictures on the wall, Margaret's smile frozen in time, my children as toddlers, the car parked proudly in front of the driveway decades ago. He narrated as he filmed, mocking the decor, mocking the outdated furniture, mocking the museum vibes. Every word felt like a needle pushed into the skin. When I asked him to put the phone away, he grinned and told me the internet loved nostalgia, that he was just making content. His tone carried no respect, only the bravado of someone who thought the world belonged to him. He did not see me as grandfather, or elder, or man. He saw me as material. The meal itself was a stage. David leaned back in his chair, speaking of opportunities, foreign investors, new horizons. Linda sat beside him, her posture immaculate, her eyes sharp. She dropped phrases about financial stability and protecting assets, always glancing at me as though waiting for weakness. Rebecca sat across the table, quiet but present, her silence an answer of its own. She looked down when the conversation grew sharp, unwilling to defend me, unwilling to confront them. Halfway through the meal, David cleared his throat. He said the house had grown too large for one man, that it needed too much care, that perhaps it was time to let it go. He spoke of value, of how the market was strong, of how I could move somewhere more comfortable. Linda added that there were excellent retirement facilities nearby, places with security and community, where I would not need to worry about maintenance. Their voices were sweet, but the meaning was venom. They wanted the house, and they wanted me out of it. I looked around the room at the photographs, the bookshelves, the worn armchair where Margaret used to sit. Every corner of that house was a memory carved into wood and plaster. It was not just a structure, it was a history. Yet to them, it was a number waiting to be cashed. Then Thomas, with the tactlessness of youth, said what the others had been. Circling, he leaned back in his chair, smirking, and told everyone he had already spoken to a potential buyer. He said young families loved character homes like mine, that with a little renovation this place could fetch a strong price. He said it with pride, as though arranging the erasure of my life was an accomplishment worth boasting about. The silence that followed was thick. David did not rebuke him. Linda smiled faintly, pleased by his initiative. Rebecca pressed her lips together but said nothing. In that silence, I understood that my grandson had become the blunt instrument for his parents' ambition. What they wanted, he would say aloud. What they planned, he would carry out. Later that evening, Thomas pulled me aside, his voice low but his arrogance undimmed. He said I shouldn't fight it, that everyone agreed it was the right move, that hanging on to the house was selfish when it could serve someone else. He spoke as though I were already gone, as though my presence in that house was temporary, inconvenient. I watched him walk away, his phone glowing in his hand, already composing the next piece of content. And I felt something shift inside me, not rage, not despair, but the cold certainty of betrayal. It was one thing for children to drift away, to measure a father by what he could provide. It was another to see a grandson blood of my bloodstand, ready to sell the last place that held his grandmother's laughter. That night, after they left, I sat in the garage again. The car waited in the shadows, patient, steady. I touched the steering wheel and thought of Margaret, of the night she had stumbled into my arms after the crash, alive because steel had held where flesh could not. I thought of the way she decorated the house, the hours she poured into making it not just a shelter but a home. To sell it would not just be a financial act. It would be a grave robbery, stripping away her memory. Brick by brick, in the days that followed, calls came from agents I had never contacted. They asked politely if I was considering listing. They mentioned Thomas by name. One even said he seemed eager to help his grandfather transition. The audacity was breathtaking. A boy barely into manhood had begun laying the foundation to evict me from my own life. I confronted David. He didn't deny it. He said Thomas was thinking ahead, that the family needed to plan for the inevitable. He said it was better to make decisions now than wait until they were forced. Forced by what? By time, by inconvenience. I reminded him I was still here, still capable, still standing. He brushed it aside, saying sentiment could not outweigh practicality. Rebecca visited again, this time with her eyes full of conflict. She told me she didn't agree with selling the house so quickly, but she also said she couldn't stand against David and Linda. She said unity mattered more than disagreement. Her words landed like stones. Unity at the cost of truth is not unity, it is surrender. I began keeping notes of every conversation, every attempt to push me out. I made copies of documents, recorded dates, stored letters. I understood now that this was not just a family squabble. It was a campaign, organized and deliberate. They wanted the house, the assets, the company, and eventually the memory. Piece by piece, they wanted to strip away everything until I was reduced to a signature and a bed in a retirement facility. But I had lived long enough to know that even the most polished plans crack under pressure. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my patience was surrender. They had forgotten who I was, what I had built, what I had endured. As I sat again beside the car, the papers spread before me, I told myself the truth. They had crossed a line. A son mocking a car, a daughter surrendering her voice, a grandson selling a house, each wound cut deeper, but this one reached the bone. This was no longer about property. It was about erasure. And erasure does not happen quietly, they thought. They had me cornered. What they didn't see was that corners can make a man dangerous. They came with luggage, not flowers. Suitcases rolled across my porch like a declaration, handles clicking, wheels rattling over the old boards Margaret and I had nailed down decades ago. David said the house needed a deep clean, a fumigation, a week of contractors and paint. Linda called it a transition, a short stay, somewhere supportive while the work was done. Rebecca stood behind them, eyes lowered, hands clasped, as if praying the floor would swallow her before she had to meet my stare. Thomas circled with his phone raised just enough to pretend he wasn't filming. A family arrives in force when it wants to celebrate. Mine arrived as if serving papers. I didn't argue at the door. I let them in. I moved slower than usual, let my hands search for the banister, let my gaze drift as if it had trouble finding an anchor. I had learned long ago that a man can learn more in 1 hour of being underestimated than in a year of shouting. In my shirt pocket, a small recorder the size of a matchbox hummed to life. It was a simple tool, not clever, not hidden by any gadgetry, just a little red light tucked under the edge of a handkerchief. I had bought it at a pharmacy where seniors purchase pill organizers and reading glasses. I slipped it in before they knocked. They staged their concern with polished efficiency. Linda unpacked forms onto the kitchen table the way a surgeon lays out instruments, neat, aligned, lethal. She used phrases that sound kind until you listen for the steel under the velvet, respite care, temporary placement, safety. David walked the perimeter, making notes on his phone about deferred maintenance, pointing at the roofline, the draft under the back door, the creak in the stair. Rebecca opened cupboards and took inventory of expired spices, as if time gone stale were evidence of cognitive decline. Thomas drifted toward the garage before I called him back with nothing more than a look. He flinched, then smirked. and returned to the kitchen where the forms waited for signatures they were not going to get. I asked them to explain the plankly, slowly, as though I needed help understanding. Linda said a trial stay at a nearby residence would give everyone peace of mind. David added that contractors needed space to work without me in the way. Rebecca murmured that I would have activities and meals included. Thomas mentioned that the place had great Wi-Fi. Every word found the recorder. Every phrase mapped their intent. When Linda moved from trial stay to medical assessment, I asked what assessment meant. She said a clinician would simply confirm I could benefit from support. She didn't say the word guardianship, but the forms on the table were already walking in that direction. I recognized the structure of them, pre-printed lines with my name typed in, boxes checked for assistance with finances and medication, a signature line flagged with a sticky note that read, in her tidy hand, "Just here." I pretended to misplace my glasses and asked for help finding them, while the three of them began searching. I slipped 2 sheets from the bottom of the stack and slid them into the inside pocket of my jacket. I wanted evidence of the language they had chosen for me, without my consent. The recorder kept its steady blink. By noon, they had me in David's SUV, Thomas in the back seat, Linda beside me in front, Rebecca following in her own car. I watched my house shrink in the side mirror, the porch where Margaret once drank coffee. In the mornings, the window where I had set my tools to cool after long nights in the garage. The SUV's cabin smelled of new leather and ambition. The ride was quiet, except for Linda's gentle reminders about how restful the facility would be. No stairs, no chores, no worries. She said the word dignity as if it was something that could be packaged into a brochure. The facility sat behind a fountain and a brick entrance that tried very hard to look like a college campus. A woman with a laminated badge greeted us with a smile that never reached her eyes. She offered a tour, and we followed down hallways to clean to be lived in. The rooms were small, efficient, lined with chairs designed to be easy to clean. On a whiteboard near the nurse's station, names were written in careful handwriting, paired with the word redirection beside more than one. I asked what redirection meant. The guide said it was just a gentle tactic for those who wandered. Wandered the way you describe a mind that refuses to sit quietly while others write its schedule. Linda asked about admission timelines. David asked about monthly fees, bundled services, automatic payment options. Thomas asked about visitor policies and whether filming was allowed. Rebecca kept her distance, touching nothing, saying little. I nodded at the right moments, asked small questions about meal times and medication storage, allowed my hand to tremble just enough when I signed the visitor log. Then I excused myself to the restroom and photographed the admission packet tucked into Linda's folder. The camera on my phone was old, the images grainy, but the dates and the phrases were legible. Voluntary placement, financial management authorization, release of information to designated family representatives. The recorder caught the rustle of paper and the cadence of their voices outside the door, discussing where to store my car keys during the trial period. On the way back to the SUV, I paused by a bench in the sun and sat longer than necessary. Linda tilted her head as if listening to a distant sound only she could hear, then told me we could schedule the move for Monday. She spoke about packing, essentials, about comfort items, about a week passing quickly. David said contractors were available midweek. Rebecca said she could help with clothes. Thomas said he would find a place to store the old junk. The old junk, my tools, my bench, the box of sketches with Margaret's notes in the margins. I returned home and, for the first time in our long life together, locked the garage from the inside and pulled the shade. I photographed everything: the odometer, the VIN plate, the weld lines I had reinforced by hand all those years ago, the small indentation on the wheel where Margaret had chipped her ring on a winter morning. I recorded the model number of the recorder itself, the time, the date, and spoke 2 sentences into it about who had been present that day, where we had gone, and what had been proposed. Then I placed the recorder on a shelf where it could hear the kitchen if anyone spoke in that room. The next morning, while the house was quiet, I visited the bank and set alerts on every account so that any change required my physical presence. I signed a letter revoking permission for third-party inquiries without a court order signed by a judge whose name I could read. The teller didn't ask questions. I didn't volunteer explanations. On the way out, I rented another safe deposit box and placed the recorder's microSD copy inside an envelope marked with that day's date. I stopped at a copy shop and scanned the 2 forms I had lifted from Linda's stack. One of them listed me as unable to consistently manage personal affairs, a phrase I had never been accused of in my life until my son married a woman who believed control was a virtue. The other pre-authorized change of address for mail. Change of address so my letters would no longer come to the house with the garage I kept like a chapel. I met with a lawyer that afternoon, a quiet man with a small office and a wall of framed degrees that looked earned rather than purchased. I explained, without drama, what my family planned. I showed him the forms and the photographs. He read in silence, then nodded once. He prepared a declaration of capacity, signed by a physician I had known for years, a straightforward professional who tracked my numbers without dressing them up. He also drafted a letter instructing any facility that admission on my behalf required my explicit signature in the presence of counsel. Copies went to the facility's intake desk, to my bank, to the company's legal counsel, and to a file I kept under the seat of the car. Paper does not blink when pressure arrives. 2 days later, David returned with an agent in tow. They walked the rooms with tape measures, discussed square footage, and muttered about resale. I stayed out of their way, sitting at the kitchen table, the recorder beneath a folded newspaper. David spoke as if I weren't there, referring to me in the third person, predicting how quickly I would settle. The agent asked about the garage and whether the car would be removed. David said yes, the car was a liability. The word liability hung in the air like a slur. I kept my eyes on the newspaper while the recorder worked. That evening, Rebecca came. Alone, she stood in the doorway, not crossing the threshold for a long minute, then stepped inside. She said the others believed I would be safer in the residence. That conflict would fade once I adjusted. She admitted she didn't like the pace, but said she couldn't oppose them without tearing the family in half. I listened. I didn't try to win her. People who choose comfort over courage do not change their minds because you present them with a better argument. They change when the cost of comfort rises. I thanked her for visiting. She looked relieved, as if being thanked absolved her of choosing the easier side. When she left, I opened the drawer where I kept the founder's certificate and the notarized copies of the consent clause. I counted the sets, 1 for the bank, 1 for the lawyer, 1 for the state, 1 for the company, 1 for the box. Then I placed a final set in an envelope addressed to Henry with a note in my print. If they move me, file this immediately. He would know what to do. On Friday, while I trimmed the hedge, a van pulled into the driveway. 2 men hopped out with wardrobes and plastic crates. They said they had been booked for a Monday move, pack and stack, box and go. I told them they had the wrong address. One of them checked his phone and read my name aloud. He looked embarrassed. I told them to leave. They left quickly, and I wrote down the name of the company printed on the side of the van. Later, I called to confirm the order and requested a copy of the work ticket be emailed to me. Paper again. By Saturday, the refrigerator held 3 labeled containers. Linda had dropped off meals to make it easier. The labels named the days, convenience, masquerading as care. On the counter next to them, she had left a new set of forms in a fresh folder, this time with a printed letter from a clinic I'd never visited. It recommended an observational period and supervised living. The letter had a digital signature. The clinic's phone number went to a main line that routed through a tree of options, until a voicemail caught you and turned you into silence. I photographed the letter, then slid it into the folder where I kept everything else. The house became a stage set for my disappearance. My children rehearsed the choreography with confidence. Monday, drop-off. Tuesday, contractors. Wednesday, evaluation. Thursday, signatures. Friday, listing. I could feel the cadence of it as clearly as I've felt the rhythm of a production line ramping toward speed. I moved through Sunday like a shadow, careful, unhurried, noting every routine I completed without assistance. The trash out on time, the stove on for coffee, off when the pot went empty, medications sorted and swallowed, bottles returned to their shelf, keys placed in their dish, lights on at dusk, off at 10. I filmed small clips not for the internet, but for a file stamped with time and date, proof that the life they called unmanageable still ran on rails I had laid for myself. When Monday came, they arrived with smiles stretched too wide. David announced the plans. Linda checked off boxes. Rebecca stood near the door. Thomas glanced at his phone and then at me, waiting to see if there would be a scene. There wasn't. I walked to the garage, the recorder in my pocket, and ran my palm across the car's fender one more time. I set my hand on the hood and kept it there until my pulse slowed. Then I turned and faced them. I told them I would pack a bag. I said I wanted to bring a few papers to review while settling in. I moved through the bedroom, deliberate folded shirts and socks, slid the declaration of capacity and the council letter into the lining of the suitcase, placed copies of the consent certificate beneath the stack of clothes. I picked up the framed photo of Margaret and me at the county fair, removed the picture, and slipped a micro SD card behind the glass before sealing it again. If they managed to move me, the evidence would move with me. We drove to the residence, in a quiet column of cars. At the intake desk, a different attendant greeted us. She recognized my name from the letters. Her smile was smaller. She asked for my signature. I requested a private moment to read the documents. She obliged, and I stepped aside to a table near a window where the sun cut across the page. The first form called itself voluntary. The second authorized the release of medical information to designated representatives. The third allowed the facility to secure my vehicle keys. I took out a pen, wrote 2 sentences across the top in clear print. I do not consent to admission today. I am present for a tour only. I dated and initialed the note, then placed the pen down and waited. When the attendant returned and read what I had written, she paused. Policies live and die by the ink on a page. She excused herself and spoke to someone in a back office. When she returned, her tone had shifted from automatic hospitality to careful compliance. Without my signature, there would be no admission. Without admission, there would be no keys surrendered, no handoff of mail, no change of address. David's jaw tightened. Linda's politeness lost a shade of color. Thomas looked bored. Rebecca exhaled, quiet, as if relieved a verdict had been delayed rather than delivered. We left without a room. On the drive home, David filled the air with words about how uncooperative I was making things, about how much simpler it could be. Linda said there were other ways to ensure safety. Her voice had dropped the syrup and kept only the metal. Thomas stared out the window at a world that had never told him no. Rebecca said little. I counted streetlights. When we reached the house, I told them I needed rest. They lingered in the doorway, as if expecting the door to open on its own too. The future they had planned. It didn't. They walked away in twos, their steps frustrated, but confident that pressure would win tomorrow what persuasion had not won today. I locked the door, pulled the shade, and sat at the kitchen table with my notes. The recorder had done its work. The forms were copied and filed. The facility had declined to admit me without my consent. The bank alerts were set. The certificate was duplicated and distributed like lifeboats around a ship I had once built, and still refused to abandon. They wanted to press me into a bed with a wristband and call it love. They wanted the house emptied, the car hauled, the past trimmed to fit a story that made them look benevolent. They had a calendar, I had a backbone. The week they chose to redraw my life would be the week I redrew the lines. Night settled over. The neighborhood with the cold clarity of winter. In the garage, the car's shape rested like a kept promise. I ran a finger along the edge of the hood and felt steel beneath my skin, not as nostalgia, but as fact. Strength is what holds when beautiful stories fall apart. They were about to learn the difference. The house had become too quiet after their last attempt to uproot me. I could feel the silence pressing against the walls, waiting for me to fold. Instead, I spent those nights preparing. The papers were in order, the recordings labeled, the lawyer briefed. What remained was not defense, but the question of legacy, what to do with the years of labor and sacrifice I had protected. If they wanted to strip me down to a dependent, I would confront them with something larger than inheritance. I began with a name, Margaret. It had been too long since her voice filled these rooms, too long since her laughter made this house feel alive. I decided that if I were to leave behind anything, it would carry her name first. Not David's, not Rebecca's, not Linda's, or Thomas's hers. The morning I walked into the company's downtown office, I carried a sealed envelope marked Margaret Vance Foundation. Inside was the framework of a trust, one that redirected the majority of my assets into a charitable fund devoted to worker safety and family aid. Henry had helped me draft the details. He knew the law, the bylaws, the hidden levers within the company's constitution. Together, we had written terms that were unshakable. Any descendant of mine could claim a portion of the estate only if they served a decade in community service projects under the Foundation's banner. Not board membership, not token gestures, 10 years of actual work. I wasn't taking money away. I was tying it to duty. That was the only currency I respected anymore. At the bank, I signed the final authorizations. The clerk's pen hovered over the line where my family's names had once been written as beneficiaries. I drew a single line through them. The ink was steady, not shaking, not hesitant. When I placed my initials beside it, I felt something unclench inside me. For months, I had played along with their staged concern, their rehearsed pity, their schemes in the kitchen. Now, for the first time, I wasn't only protecting myself, I was setting the terms of their future. That evening, I invited them to dinner. I used words they couldn't refuse. Important news, urgent decisions, legacy. I knew they would come if they thought a fortune was at stake. They arrived in polished shoes and stiff smiles. Linda carried another folder, David a glass of scotch, before even sitting down. Rebecca her conflicted silence, and Thomas his restless phone. I kept the meal simple: meatloaf, potatoes. The kind of dinner Margaret loved to make when the children were young. They barely touched it. They were waiting for the announcement, the unveiling of their prize. I stood holding only a single sheet of paper and told them plainly, the estate was no longer theirs to divide like scavengers. It had been placed in trust. It bore Margaret's name, and any of them who wanted to see a penny of it would have to spend 10 years serving the community through the foundation's work. 10 years, documented, supervised, verified. David laughed, sharp and mocking, as if I had told a joke unworthy of him. Linda's lips thinned, her eyes calculating the legal angles. Rebecca looked down, then up, then down again, trapped in her own indecision. Thomas cursed under his breath, the word ridiculous slipping out like a spoiled child denied dessert. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I explained that the documents were signed, notarized, and filed in 3 separate locations. Not even a judge could dissolve them without years of battle, and by then their youth and ambition would be spent. I told them the Foundation's first initiative would be scholarships for the children of factory workers injured on the line, the same men I had once stood beside. I told them it was the only way I could honor Margaret properly, by tying our name not to greed, but to service. Linda broke first. She said it was manipulation, cruelty disguised as morality. She accused me of trying to control them from the grave. David joined in, shouting about betrayal, about how he had built his own success and deserved the security of inheritance. Thomas stormed out, muttering that he wouldn't waste his 20s in soup kitchens. Only Rebecca lingered in silence, her face pale, her mouth pressed tight. I didn't argue. I let them rage. Every word was recorded. The device sat under the tablecloth, blinking silently as it gathered their contempt. Their fury was proof enough that I had struck the nerve. If they had loved me, if they had respected Margaret's memory, they would have seen the Foundation as honor. Instead, they saw it as chains that told me all I needed to know when they left. Slamming doors and muttering threats of lawyers, I sat alone at the table and finished the plate they had ignored. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt earned. For months, I had been cornered, underestimated, treated as fragile. Now I had reminded the man myself that dignity doesn't beg. It dictates. Later that night, I walked into the garage and laid my hand on the hood of the old car. Its steel was cold but steady. It had saved Margaret once, and in a way, it had saved me now. Every sneer, every insult about that car had led to this moment. They mocked the relic, not knowing it was the cornerstone of everything they owned. And soon the world would know too, because I wasn't finished. Securing the Foundation was only the beginning. The documents would outlive me, but I intended to stand before the public myself, to tell them why I had done it, and to show them what honor looked like in an age that had forgotten. The company's annual event was only weeks away. My name was still on the list, though David believed he could erase it. I would walk onto that stage, in the very car they despised, and remind them all that worth is not counted in dollars but in lives saved, promises kept, and dignity refused to be sold. The night stretched long, but I didn't feel weary. For the first time in months, I felt a clarity sharper than any blade they could raise against me. Let them plan, let them threaten. The ink was dry, the papers sealed, the foundation real. They thought they could write me out of history. Instead, I had written them into obligation. They wanted my silence. They were about to hear my voice. The storm broke in the very place they thought they were. Untouchable inside the glass tower, where their names adorned office doors and their arrogance filled every corridor. I entered with my lawyer at my side. The documents in his briefcase as heavy as the years I had carried there. Contempt. The company's boardroom was already crowded, the air thick with perfume, cologne, and ambition. David sat at the head of the table, his tie knotted tight, his confidence radiating as if he had already written me out of history. Linda hovered near him, whispering like a strategist in wartime. Rebecca was there too, pale and uneasy, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles whitened. They expected an old man clinging to illusions. What they saw was something different. The meeting began with David declaring a vote of no confidence. He laid out a performance, accusing me of mental decline, reckless spending, and irrelevance. He even held up copies of the viral video Thomas had posted weeks earlier, me stumbling in the driveway, mocked online as the senile relic. They chuckled in the room, forgetting who had taught them to walk, to speak, to survive. I waited until the laughter faded. Then I slid a folder across the polished table. Inside were notarized statements, recordings of their private conversations, and financial transfers traced directly from their accounts. The smugness drained from their faces as the lawyer detailed each line. Linda moving funds offshore, David negotiating secretly with rival automakers, Rebecca signing papers she claimed she never saw. The room went silent. For the first time, their voices did not overlap mine. I stood, my hand rested on the back of a chair as I told them the truth. I had allowed them to believe I was fading because it revealed their hearts more clearly than any confrontation could. I told them I wasn't angry at being mocked at watching Margaret's name dragged through mud by her own children. I reminded them that every brick of that tower, every dollar in their accounts, had roots in sacrifices they had. Long forgotten, the board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down, others scribbled notes, unwilling to meet my eyes. They knew my share still carried weight, and the documents I had filed that morning had already shifted control. The foundation now held the deciding block of stock. Margaret's name, not theirs, would be stamped on every future decision. David tried to interrupt, shouting that it was illegal, that I was manipulating charity to hide weakness. I didn't argue. I simply pressed a button on the remote in my pocket. The screen at the far end of the room lit up with the recording from our family dinner, their voices dripping with scorn, their fury when I unveiled the foundation. Every word, every sneer, every insult was captured in clear sound. There was no arguing with their own voices. Rebecca broke first. She sank into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Linda whispered something sharp to David, who slammed his fist on the table, his confidence cracking into panic. They looked like cornered predators, furious not at what they had done, but at being caught. I ended the meeting with no grand speech, just a single sentence. You wanted me erased. Instead, I've written you down in ink the world cannot wash away. The lawyer gathered the documents, and we left them in silence. Behind us, the room buzzed with fragments of argument, but none of it mattered anymore. The power they thought was theirs had already slipped from their grasp. Outside, the city lights spread across Detroit, harsh and unblinking. I walked slowly, my cane tapping against the concrete. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking into retreat. I was walking toward the stage where everything would come to light, because the next battle wasn't behind closed doors. It would be in front of cameras, investors, workers, the public, the very people whose lives had been touched by the machines we built. And when I drove that old car onto the stage, they would see what my family refused to. That dignity doesn't rust, that love doesn't fade, and that legacy isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we save. The storm had broken, but I was still standing, and the real reckoning was only a step away. The library was quieter than a church, the kind of silence that settles not because no one speaks, but because every breath is heavy with waiting. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras trained on me. A few of my former students had slipped into the crowd. Older now, faces softened by time, but eyes still carrying the spark I once saw when they discovered a truth for themselves. My children sat up front, Grant stiff as marble, Elise stone-faced, Lillian avoiding my gaze. Tyler with his phone clutched like a lifeline, but, for once, not filming. I placed the old teacher's journal on the lectern. Its leather was cracked, pages yellowed at the edges, corners curled from decades of use. I let the room see it. The object was unimpressive, even fragile, yet it carried more weight than every speech they had written in my name, every copyright form they had stolen, every lie they had spun. I spoke without flourish. I told them this book contained 40 years of lessons, dates, events, but also names, questions, the arguments of young minds learning to test the world. I flipped 2 entries where students challenged me, disagreed with me, and I recorded their courage. I showed the passages where I wrote of my pride when a struggling boy found his footing, or when a girl who had never spoken up raised her hand for the first time. These were not inventions of memory, they were written in ink. Long before ambition poisoned the air. The board members from the district leaned forward as I read a particular section from the late 90s when an accusation against me had once been dismissed because I could show, in my own hand, where I was and what I had taught that very day. I reminded them that truth has a way of leaving marks, even if men try to erase them. Then I turned to the accusation Grant had leveled. I held up the forged documents he had circulated, sloppy rushed, inconsistent. And beside them, I read my own notes from the same period, my handwriting, my observations, names of students who were now respected adults in this very community. A murmur went through the audience. I did not accuse my son directly. I didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. Finally, I closed the journal. I looked at my children, and I said clearly, "You used my name like a coin to be traded. But names are not currency. They are memory. They are duty. And duty is not for sale." The applause began cautiously, then swelled. Some clapped for vindication, others because they saw the drama end. For me, it was neither victory nor celebration. It was release. I stepped down from the lectern, walked past my children without pause, and handed the journal to the head librarian. "It belongs here now," I told her, "not locked in a family safe, not twisted into a campaign slogan. Here, where any eye can see it, any hand can open it, and the truth cannot be buried. The cameras followed me, but I did not stay. My work was done the moment the journal changed hands. The story was no longer mine to defend. It was written, and it would outlive me. Now, standing alone after the noise has faded, I can look back without bitterness. What strikes me is not the betrayal itself. I had long suspected how ambition corrodes love, but the silence of those who knew better and chose to look away. Lillian's hesitation wounded more than Grant's aggression. Tyler's cruelty hurt less than Elise's calculated indifference, because betrayal in the open can be fought. It is the quiet consent of family that digs deepest. That is the lesson I carry, and it is not gentle. When people show you they will trade your dignity for their comfort, believe them. Do not wait for loyalty where only convenience lives. I endured, because I kept records, not only of history, but of my own life. That habit saved me. In a world where stories can be twisted overnight, where even blood will rewrite your past for profit, the only weapon is evidence pages, dates, words that cannot be undone. So here is my message to you, whoever is listening, especially if you are in my years, facing the erosion of your own name. Write it down. Keep proof of your life, your work, your truth. Do not hand it blindly to children who mistake inheritance for entitlement. Protect it, not with anger, but with clarity. And when the time comes, give it freely, not to those who abuse it, but to the world that deserves to see you as you were. They tried to erase me, but you cannot erase a life lived in truth. If my journey speaks to yours, stay with me. More stories are coming, and perhaps in them you'll find the strength to guard your own. Subscribe, and we'll keep walking through these battles together.